Lindsay Clancy, the person before the crisis. Before we talk about the tragedy, I want to talk about Lindsay. Not the headline, not the courtroom, not the diagnosis, Lindsay. Because if we are going to tell this story through a people-centered lens, we have to remember that the woman at the center of this case had a lifelong before January 24th, 2023. Lindsay was a wife, she was a mother, and she was a labor and delivery nurse. From the accounts I have reviewed, she was compassionate and good at what she did. Think about that for a minute. Her profession put her alongside women and families during some of the most vulnerable and emotional moments of their lives. She had a professional identity built around caring for other people. That doesn't make her perfect. It doesn't make what happened disappear, but it matters. Because the worst period of someone's life should not become the only period of their life we remember. Before the crisis, there was a Lindsay her husband and mother-in-law knew before the psychosis. They knew her personality, they knew her baseline, they knew the woman she had been before something began to change. And I think that distinction is important. Because when someone develops severe psychiatric symptoms, particularly symptoms that dramatically change their behavior, the people closest to them may be watching someone they recognize physically while struggling to recognize the person they know emotionally. That's part of what makes the story so difficult. There was Lindsay, and then there was what was happening to Lindsay. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. She was trying to get help. This is one of the pieces of Lindsay's story that I don't want us to overlook. According to the information presented in the case, Lindsay began reaching out for help as her condition deteriorated. In November 2022, she expressed severe anxiety, insomnia, and loss of appetite to her family and entered a specialized perinatal behavioral health program. By late December, her symptoms had become serious enough that she sought emergency evaluation. And on New Year's Eve, she voluntarily admitted herself to McLean Hospital. She remained there for 5 days. She continued psychiatric treatment after her discharge, seeing psychiatrists, therapists, and psychiatric nurse practitioners. She even had a psychiatric appointment the day before the tragedy. That doesn't answer every question. It doesn't tell us that every treatment decision was correct. And it certainly doesn't erase the devastating outcome. But it does tell us something important. Lindsay was seeking help. This wasn't simply a story of somebody who refused treatment and walked away from everybody trying to help her. There was an effort to get better. There was an effort to understand what was happening. There were medical professionals involved. And according to the defense's medical theory, there was an illness that was becoming increasingly severe. The medication question. This is where we have to slow down. Because there have been significant arguments in this case about Lindsay's medications and whether medication changes contributed to or exacerbated her psychiatric deterioration. Defense experts argued that underlying bipolar disorder, postpartum hormonal changes, profound sleep deprivation, acute stress, and medication changes contributed to a manic and psychotic state. The defense also argued that antidepressant treatment without adequate mood stabilization may have worsened that condition. But that is an expert in defense theory. We need to identify it as such. We shouldn't turn a contested medical opinion into an established fact. That's important because Grace and Gavel isn't about finding the easiest explanation. It's about asking the harder questions. What was known? What was suspected? What did the doctors understand? What did the family understand? What symptoms were visible? What symptoms were hidden? And what could possibly have been understood at the time? Those questions matter. Lindsay as a mother. And then there's another part of Lindsay's identity that I think deserves to remain visible. She was a mother. We do not need to make her children part of the spectacle. We don't need to discuss their ending in order to acknowledge that they were part of Lindsay's life. They mattered to her identity. They were part of the family she was building. And when we talk about Lindsay, we should be able to say that without turning their tragedy into content. because the children are not plot devices. They are human beings. So we can leave their story where it belongs while still recognizing something fundamental. Lindsay was a mother, and that matters when we're trying to understand the whole person. Lindsay was more than the final chapter. This is where I want to push back against the way true crime can sometimes flatten people. Someone becomes a headline, then a diagnosis gets attached to the headline. Then the diagnosis becomes the explanation for everything, and eventually the person disappears. I don't want to do that to Lindsay. Psychosis can profoundly affect a person's perception of reality. It can alter behavior. It can produce symptoms that are terrifying and completely outside the person's normal baseline. But Lindsay was not born on January 24th, 2023. She had a life before that day. She had a career. She had relationships. She had people who knew her. She had a family. She had a role as a mother. She had professional identity as a nurse. She had strengths. She had weaknesses. She had ordinary days. She had difficult days. She had a version of herself that existed before the crisis. And that woman deserves to be remembered. And then the legal questions begin. Once we've established the person, then and only then, I think we're ready to move into the legal questions. Because the law doesn't ask only what happened. It asks questions about mental state, intent, causation, evidence, expert testimony, credibility, and what the evidence actually proves. And that distinction is going to matter enormously in Lindsay's case. We can hold two truths at the same time. What happened was devastating, and my heart goes out to the Clancy family. And understanding Lindsay's mental state may be essential to understanding the legal case. Those statements don't cancel each other out. They coexist. And that's where I want Grace and Gavel to live. Not in excusing, not in sensationalizing, not in turning psychiatric illness into a convenient explanation for everything, and not in pretending that the illness wasn't there. Instead, what happened to Lindsay? What was happening inside Lindsay? What did the people around her know? What help did she seek? What did the medical professionals see? What did they miss? And ultimately, what does the evidence actually tell us? Because Lindsay deserves more than to be remembered as the woman in the headline. She was a whole person before the crisis, and we're going to tell her story. That's where we should begin. Thank you for tuning in to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. My name is Buffy. I'm an almost 18-year criminal defense attorney. If you got value from this, please consider checking out Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion, as we do adopt a victim-centered approach, as well as not getting into sensationalism and talking about gory details and all of those things, because it's more about the people and who they were rather than what they did on their worst day. So if you got value from this, please consider liking and subscribing, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, and hopefully you'll come back and see me again soon. Bye-bye. Appreciate your support.